Morning, Willen. Morning, everybody.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the meeting with the Connecticut Airport Authority. We started off this year wanting to get insights into the operations of each of the agencies and quasi-publics that are within our review. Last week, we heard from the Department of Motor Vehicles. This week, we'll be hearing from the Connecticut Airport Authority, from the Department of Transportation, and the Connecticut Port Authority. So it's a busy week before us. We start off today with the Airport Authority on Wednesday morning, promptly at 10 a.m. We'll begin to hear from the Department of Transportation about their work over the last year and their responses to COVID. At noon on Wednesday, we'll be getting our first public hearing with DMV's legislative requests for the 2021 year and a pedestrian safety bill that's been in the works for quite some time. We'll follow that up on Friday with our meeting with the Connecticut Port Authority. So before us today, we have the Connecticut Airport Authority, and we'll get to them in a minute. I want to make sure my co-chair has gotten in before we go too far along. Mr. Clerk, do you see if Senator Castano is in?
I do not see him at this moment, Mr. Chair. If you give me one moment, I'll try and get him in on his cell phone.
That's right. We'll continue ahead. We have Kevin Dillon from the Connecticut Airport Authority, who's going to kick us off in just a moment. But first, I want to introduce my ranking member, Representative Carney.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the CAA for coming on here. I look forward to hearing about your update for the year, especially given the challenges that you all have faced due to COVID and plans for the future. So hopefully this will be an enlightening discussion and will sort of guide the framework that we as legislators should be following as we try to get out of this pandemic. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Representative Carney. And that was the perfect introduction. Frankly, there are a lot of industries that are impacted by COVID. In fact, all of our lives, our daily lives, are impacted by the realities of COVID. But the Airport Authority itself and airports and air travel across the world has been greatly impacted. Our team at Connecticut Airport Authority, Bradley specifically, has done a great job keeping the committee updated on the day-to-day challenges that they're facing. This is an opportunity for us to get in depth and deal with the incredible work that they've done to keep the Airport Authority afloat, Bradley operational, and hear a little bit of a preview of the challenges that they see coming ahead. They'll be back before us in a few weeks, maybe a month, to talk about their very specific and entailed public hearing about their legislative portfolio for the upcoming year. But this is an opportunity to hear directly from them about the challenges that they face, the direction they see moving forward, and an opportunity for them to give us a bit of a state of the airport. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Dillon, the the chair of the Connecticut Airport Authority.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to all of the committee members. My name is Kevin Dillon. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Airport Authority. I also have Alex Peterson, who's our Manager of Government Affairs, with me in the room as well. Certainly want to thank you all for giving us a little bit of time today to tell you about the trials and tribulations within the aviation industry, and specifically how it's impacting Bradley Airport. I think you're all aware that the industry in the aggregate has lost hundreds of billions of dollars. When you consider the airlines, airports, and related businesses, this has been devastating to the aviation industry. And as we talk through some of the issues today, I'd ask the committee to keep in mind the business model of Bradley Airport. We are a self-sustaining enterprise fund. We take no tax revenues from the state. We have to live and die within our revenues and expenses. The revenue we bring in, we have to moderate our expenses to live within that. So you're going to hear me reference that business model quite a bit this morning. What I'd like to do is just kind of walk you through almost on a timeline basis what has been occurring here at Bradley and tell you what our responses to that have been. Talk a little bit about where it stands today, and then finish up talking about the future of Bradley Airport. But very early on in the pandemic, we were impacted very heavily right up front. If you went back to last April, the airport was down about 97% in terms of passenger numbers as compared to a similar time period prior to the pandemic. So we knew very early on it was going to be very important for us to try to reinstill confidence in passengers to get them flying again. So right up front, we focused on enhanced cleaning throughout the terminal building with an emphasis on high touch areas. We were one of the first airports in the country to require both employees and passengers to wear face covering. We deployed hand sanitizing stations throughout the terminal. We invested in cordless electrostatic sprayer units, which we can take mobile throughout the terminal building to disinfect various areas of the terminal. And we're actually right now installing bipolar ionization units into our HVAC system here in the terminal building in an effort to further purify airflow throughout the terminal. And naturally, we posted signage and we're constantly making announcements reminding people that they need to wear masks. They have to keep the mask on the entire time they're here in the airport and to the greatest extent, maintain social distancing. And we've actually made physical modifications to the building. We've installed plexiglass shields at high customer interaction points to limit interaction between passengers and employees for their respective safety. One of the other things that we've done is we've created a comprehensive public information initiative. It's called BDL Cares. You can go right online. It's bdlcares.com. It takes you to our website where we fully explain to passengers what they can expect coming through the airport. A lot of passengers have not traveled since prior to the pandemic, and there's been a lot of physical changes to the airport. There's been a lot of procedural changes to the airport that we're trying to highlight to passengers. It really gives them a good sense as to what to expect in their journey through the airport. But it also provides information about our business partners, what to expect at the TSA checkpoint, what the airlines are doing. So it's a very comprehensive website link that will give you all of that information. And naturally, we are working very directly with all of our partners here, such as the TSA. TSA has changed their procedures at the checkpoint to limit passenger and employee contact for the safety of their employees, but also for the safety of employees. And all of our concessions have undertaken a lot of improvements to enhance the safety of traveling through the airport. I'm also pleased to say that we recently received our ACI health accreditation. ACI is Airport Council International. That's a global industry organization that represents airports around the world. ACI looks at the procedures and policies individual airports have put online during the pandemic to make sure that they're operating as safe as they can. We are one of the few airports in the country that's received that ACI health accreditation. So we are certainly promoting that with the general public as well. When it comes to our airline partners, they have also undertaken significant actions to enhance safety. Naturally, they have stepped up aircraft cleaning and sanitizing. They're requiring all of their employees and passengers to wear masks throughout the entire journey on the aircraft. In fact, airlines have begun denying boarding to folks that are refusing to wear masks or take masks off during flight. They will be denied to board future flights. They've also made a lot of adjustments to their services here. Boarding procedures have been changed to maximize social distancing. Food and beverage service in many cases have been curtailed to keep people from having to take masks off while in flight. They've changed seating protocols to maintain social distancing, and other services have been adjusted, all in an effort to try to meet safety requirements and the safety that the public is demanding of airports and airlines these days. All airlines also require passengers to fill out a health acknowledgement form before they check in. That acknowledgement form states that a passenger knows they will wear a mask throughout the journey, that they're not experiencing any COVID-19 symptoms, and that they've not had contact with somebody who has tested positive for COVID within the past 14 days. So again, a lot is being done to enhance passenger safety coming through the airport. As it relates to our own workforce, right up front at the start of the pandemic, I made two commitments to employees here. First and foremost, we were going to do everything we could to protect their health. But second to that, we were going to do everything we could to protect their jobs here at the airport. And so far through the pandemic, we have been successful in meeting both. Early on, we took a lot of measures to protect the workforce. We had non-operating staff working remotely. They've essentially been telecommuting since the start of the pandemic. We are stressing the importance of social distancing in the workplace. All of our employees are required to wear face coverings when in shared and common areas. Every employee, when they come to work each day, including myself, are required to take their temperature at the start of their day. If a temperature naturally is exceeding 100.4 degrees, folks are not allowed to work that day. We send them home and then we continue to monitor their condition. If someone tests between 98.7 and 100.4, we monitor them throughout the day. So we're very careful in terms of trying to identify early on symptoms within our own employees. Naturally, in-person meetings are still being discouraged. And we've made physical alterations to the workplace here. We've installed plexiglass guards at different workstations to separate employees from one another. And we have emphasized new capacity limits in areas like break rooms, for example. When it comes to travel, we limit travel in CAA vehicles to one person. There can only be one person in the vehicle. And to the extent possible, we have limited in-state and out-of-state travel to absolute necessities. Cleaning contractors are constantly in the workplaces. We use those sprayers that I talked about earlier to disinfect on a constant basis all of the workplace surfaces. However, despite our best efforts, since the start of the pandemic, we have had 19 CAA employees. That's out of an employee base of about 150 have tested positive for COVID since last March. And sadly, one of our colleagues passed away from the disease last year. We are very much looking forward to getting our workforce vaccinated. We're working with DPH right now. Our entire firefighting unit has already been vaccinated. They fell under the 1A group as medical responders. We are now working with DPH to try to get as many of our remaining workforce vaccinated as soon as possible. Most of our frontline employees will fall into the 1B category. So we're hoping as we get into the spring, we'll be able to get those employees vaccinated. But as I said before, the early impacts of the pandemic were very evident in the aviation world and certainly here at Bradley. Again, as I said before, we were down 97% in April. But if you look at where we went between May and June, we started to get some slight recovery. In fact, as we entered into June, we brought that 97% number down to 70%. We were only down 70%. I mean, still a huge number. And as you know, that's a significant impact to our bottom line. You know, again, how we make money here at Bradley, keeping in mind that we take no state resources, we have to generate user fees. So we get landing fees from the airlines, for example, for each flight they bring in. We have people that park in our parking lots that pay parking revenue to the airport. People utilize our concessions and buy food and beverage here at the airport. And passengers are also renting cars. Those are the sources of revenue that we have coming into the airport. So when you have a drop of even 70%, right, bringing it down to 70%, there's almost a direct correlation to the amount of revenue that we're bringing in. So significantly big impact on the airport. And despite the recovery that we started to experience in May and June, it was sharply curtailed when the state introduced the travel advisory on June 24th. And just to remind you, that travel advisory applied to any passenger that was coming into Connecticut from a high impact state. And that was determined by a state that had a positive test rate higher than 10 per 100,000 of population, or a 10% positivity rate in terms of testing. Okay, so over time, what has happened, just about every state in the country has been put on that impacted list. And again, if someone was coming in from that area early on in June and over the summer, they were required to quarantine for 14 days. That made travel almost impossible, whether it was business travel or leisure travel. You know, a business traveler coming to the state was not going to be able to quarantine for 14 days and then conduct 1 or 2 days of business. Same thing with a leisure traveler, when you think it through, someone taking a week's vacation was not going to be able to go away for a week and then come back and have to chew up 2 more weeks of vacation to quarantine. So over the summer, we lobbied the state to introduce a testing option. And I'm pleased to say that in September, the state did move forward and give us the ability to test folks. And that if you got a negative COVID test within 72 hours of arriving here in Connecticut, or any time after arriving in Connecticut, you could curtail the rest of the quarantine period. So as a result of that, we did set up a number of testing sites here at Bradley Airport. We have an in-terminal site that's run by Genesis Labs. The site operates from 10:30 in the morning to 12:30 in the morning every day. So a very large period of time covering most of the arrivals that come into the airport. Genesis will accept insurance. If folks, for whatever reason, don't have insurance available, there's a cash option of paying $125 per test. And the results are typically provided within 72 hours. Lately, they've been able to turn around results within 48 hours. But we do tell folks you have to have the expectation of 72 hours. We also entered into a partnership with Hartford Healthcare. We operate a mobile testing site in one of our surface lots, parking lot 3. The nice thing about that relationship, it's available not only to the overflow passengers that Genesis can't handle when we have high demand, but it's also open to the surrounding community as well. So it's a joint site, passengers as well as community. At the Genesis site, through last month, we had already tested about 33,000 passengers. On any given day, we typically test somewhere between 300 to 400 passengers. But unfortunately, despite the fact that we introduced the testing option, we really haven't been able to move the needle all that much in terms of overall passenger declines here at the airport. And, you know, quite frankly, on any given day, we are averaging being down somewhere between 70 to 75%. So we certainly do have a sustained impact on our revenues. When you look at what the airlines are doing in response to the drop in passenger traffic, they have all across the board eliminated large segments of their route structure. In fact, on any given day, we're typically down somewhere to 50 to 60% of our pre-pandemic flight level. And again, as I said earlier, all of this translates into a big hit on the bottom line. When you look at services like Aer Lingus and Air Canada, those services have been suspended since the start of the pandemic. Up front, there were restrictions put in place that did not allow them to operate. There was a restriction on transatlantic travel. Any transatlantic flights coming into the country had to go into very specific airports that were identified by the federal government. Unfortunately, Bradley was not one of those airports. Our Air Canada service has been suspended because of the restrictions on the Canadian border that limit travel to only essential travel. While the federal restriction on transatlantic travel has been lifted, international business demand or international travel is so far down, it makes it impossible for Aer Lingus to resume service. And while they are still very much committed to Bradley Airport, we're not anticipating that they're going to talk about resuming service until the end of 2021. Air Canada is still restricted because of those restrictions on the Canadian border, and we do not see that service resuming until those restrictions are lifted. But as I said, across the board, all airlines, even airlines that are providing just domestic service to Bradley Airport, have substantially cut their route structures. Delta has permanently closed their maintenance base here at Bradley. That resulted in a loss of 22 jobs. As we look to the future, we're losing the rental on the area that they leased here at the airport. That results, that alone, in a loss of $300,000 in rental income to the airport. Other tenants here have slowly started to bring operations back online. The concessions, for example, have started to return. But for the most part, many of them still can't return because it's impossible for them to maintain the operation with such a significant drop in passenger traffic. And partners such as the Sheraton Hotel here at the airport have furloughed over 90 employees. And we're now getting word that Embraer will most likely shut down their operation here at the airport. That's upwards of another 35 jobs that will be eliminated. That's just 3 tenants alone. Across the board, though, there's been other drops that have occurred here at the airport. In terms of parking, as you know, if we're down 75% in terms of activity, parking activity is way off. We have had to take the parking garage rate, which was close to $30 per day prior to the pandemic. It's now been reduced to $8 a day or $48 a week. And we've closed all of our surface lots here at the airport because we can easily accommodate the limited demand that we have simply by having people park in the parking garage. It also includes all of our employee parking is now being done in the parking garage as well. So certainly the budgetary impacts here in the CAA are large. If airlines are not bringing those flights in, we're not getting landing fees. As I said earlier, if people aren't utilizing concessions, there's no concession revenue. If people aren't renting cars, there's no rental car revenues. Rental car business here is very concerning to us from the standpoint that we're still moving forward with our ground transportation project. That's a $210 million project that we were not able to suspend at the start of the pandemic simply because we were so far committed to the project. It probably would have been worse for us to actually suspend the project. But the bonds that were issued for that project are backed solely by customer facility charges that are generated on rental car days. So if we're down 75% in terms of rental car activity, you can imagine what's happening to that revenue source that backed those bonds. Just to give you kind of a snapshot as to what's happening overall with revenues here, if you look at the last quarter of fiscal year 20, which would cover the months of April, May, and June of 20, certainly the start of the pandemic, we were below budgeted revenue targets by $10 million. That's roughly half of what we anticipated in terms of revenue coming in for that quarter. And again, it's important to point out, we are a self-sustaining enterprise fund. So when you have such a precipitous drop in revenue, we have to take immediate action in terms of cutting costs. So a very simple formula, reduce revenue equals cost cutting. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've gone about doing that in a moment. But I did want to highlight, our bond ratings here at the airport. Bond rating agencies are expressing a lot of concern about aviation and airports in general. We have stayed in constant contact with the rating agencies. We have 2 levels of debt outstanding here at the airport. We have our general airport revenue bonds, which we are working to satisfy. Those bonds cover A lot of the general operations here at the airport, it covered the initial terminal improvements, for example, that were done here at Bradley. And then we have our CFC bonds, which back that ground transportation center. On April 9th, Fitch Ratings affirmed our revenue bonds at A, but revised the outlook from stable to negative. On May 1st, Fitch took a look at the CFC revenue bonds, and while they affirmed them at triple B, they revised that outlook also from stable to negative. In September, this past September, as the pandemic and the impacts have gotten worse here, Standard & Poor's downgraded our revenue bonds from A+ to A, and they also downgraded our CFC bonds from A- to triple B. So again, impacts naturally to the cost of money for us here at the airport. Another unique issue that was occurring here at Bradley at the start of the pandemic was the fact that our airline use agreement, that's the agreement that covers our relationship with airlines here at Bradley, was set to expire. The agreement that we're operating under was supposed to expire on June 30th of last year. And just prior to the pandemic, we had negotiated a new 5-year agreement. We were just, finalizing the details. We were about to execute it, but then the pandemic hit. And as you can imagine, the airlines were not interested in signing what they consider a longer term arrangement, a 5-year arrangement with so many unknowns. That was very concerning to us at the start of the pandemic because the alternative to not having an airline agreement is to go on to a month-to-month arrangement with the airlines. So there's no certainty of rental payments in a situation like that. So in return for reaching an understanding with the airlines that they would not give back a lot of rented space here at the airport, we entered into a 1-year extension of that operating agreement. So now the agreement that we're operating under now is set to expire this coming June 30th. So we are talking with the airlines right now. It's very unlikely that they're going to sign a long-term agreement. The condition really hasn't changed all that much from when we were talking to them last March and April. So we are trying to convince them, again, in return for not turning back large areas of space to us here at the airport, we'll offer a 1-year extension. But it really remains to be seen whether or not they're going to move forward with that. In terms of government assistance, I know there's been a lot of discussion about the CARES Act on a federal level. As you may be aware, airports across the country were allocated $10 billion to share across the country. And there was a formula that the FAA applied to distribute that money. I'm very pleased to say a number of airports here in Connecticut did receive some of that funding. And I'm just going to go through the listing quickly so you get a sense as to what airports received. Down in Bridgeport at Sikorsky, they received $157,000. Danbury Municipal received $69,000. Danielson Airport received $30,000. Groton New London received $69,000. Hartford Brainerd received $69,000. Meriden Markham Municipal Airport received $30,000. Tweed New Haven received $1,160,000. Waterbury Oxford received $157,000. Robertson Field received $30,000. Wyndham received $30,000. And Bradley Airport received $28.5 million. Now, just to put the Bradley allocation in perspective, I know $28.5 million sounds like a lot of money, but $28 million essentially covers 3 months worth of operating expenses and debt service here at Bradley. So we've had to be very judicious as to how we string that money out to keep things afloat here at the airport. We are hoping that in the next version, CARES Act 2, that an allocation will be coming to the Connecticut airports again. There's been $2 billion set aside for airports. We're not exactly sure at this point what the allocation formula will be and what the level of assistance will be here at Bradley, but we are certainly hoping to get some of that much needed assistance. But I think it's important to point out, no matter what's coming to Bradley, that is not the long-term answer for us here at the airport. The level of assistance that's being provided is just scratching the surface of what airports across the country need, and certainly Bradley is no different. So as I said earlier, in the face of reduced revenues, we have no alternative but to cut costs here at the airport, knowing that we're not back.
Mr. Dillon, before we move on to the next phase, I know you put a great deal of work and thought into some of the ideas for how we approach the current challenge. I know I have members who have a number of questions about where we are. So if we could just take this moment to pause. If members have questions, please hit the raise your hand button, and I will call on you individually. I know some people have texted me saying they have some questions, so please feel free to hit the raise hand button. And then, Mr. Dillon, we'll get into the next steps after the series of questions.
Sure.
I just think there's.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, I can't even find the raise the hand button.
So here's what we'll do. We'll go to you first, Senator Kissel.
All right, I just have a
Senator
couple.
Kissel, go ahead.
Yeah, Kevin, it's good to talk to you.
Same here, Senator.
Yeah, okay, so you're in my district, Bradley's in my district, and I know I talk to a lot of constituents, they work at the airport, and you're talking specifically about passenger flights, but there's a lot of commercial traffic going in there too. Amazon has some hubs coming online. They have some already there. So as opposed to just the passenger travel, how are you doing with commercial? Because I hear the planes at 6 a.m. every day.
Yeah, there's really three categories of activity here at the airport. You have the passenger activity, commercial that I talked about. You also have the corporate and privately owned aircraft. That segment of the business, the corporate and privately owned, is not off as much as passenger activity is, but it's generally down about 20% in terms of what we would normally experience. And then the cargo business has been the one bright spot here at the airport, where, as you can imagine, because people are home during the pandemic, there's more online ordering. That's how people are getting goods and services. So that has actually increased. And as you pointed out, Amazon operates here. They've helped quite a bit in terms of increasing cargo value, but FedEx and UPS as well are up. One of the interesting things, though, when it relates to cargo and you compare the return that we get from the cargo business versus the passenger business, it's night and day. Cargo doesn't return a whole lot of revenue to the airport. Simply what we get typically is space rental from those companies. So that's a pretty, static return. It doesn't increase as a result of the volume of cargo going through here. But why cargo is so important to us here at the airport, it's a huge generator of employment. And, our role as an economic development engine, that's a very important component for us, is to generate jobs.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Meskers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll go along the lines of the same commentary or questioning, which is related to commercial versus passenger traffic. And I guess concretely there, what kind of steps are we taking to increase the volume of commercial traffic, particularly in goods? Because I'm assuming that the passenger traffic is not going to recover to the same level for 3, 4, 5 years, depending on business trends, and business activity and tourism. I mean, we're not expecting the virus vaccinations fully implemented. It's going to take us, 6 to 12 months to get the population of the country vaccinated. So travel is going to be curtailed on that, economic activity, et cetera. And the one bright spot is the commercial transportation. And backing up, your commentary on the bonds and debt service for the airport and the airport authority. So a lot of the bonds are dedicated resource or secured by revenues of particular economic activity. Are we continuing to service all of the bonds indiscriminately, or are the bonds being serviced on the back of the covenants that are in existence? I.e., if they're parking revenue bonds, there was no parking revenue. Are they in the process of being negotiated? How are we handling the debt service?
Right. In terms of your first question, as I said, cargo, very important business for us. We are offering, for example, to Amazon as well as our other operators, space here at the airport to expand their operations. And we are hoping that they will move forward with that expansion. Again, I don't want to get into too many of the details because some of it is being discussed with those operators right now, but rest assured, we are looking to the future as it relates to cargo. We have a lot of available property here at Bradley. One of the areas that we'll be adding to that inventory of property is where our existing rental car operations are. They'll be ultimately going into the ground transportation center. And we think that represents a great area for Amazon in particular to expand because their immediate, their existing operation is immediately adjacent to it. As it relates to the other segment of activity here, principally corporate activity, we do believe that that will resume once business travel starts to resume. It is one of the big unknowns, though, in the industry as to what level of business travel will return. Our feeling right now is that those companies that have to travel to see external customers, over time that will resume, but a big question mark about internal company travel. You know, for example, you know, if Pratt & Whitney has operations throughout the country, are they likely to travel to their other operations, or are they going to use forums just like this, Zoom, to conduct business meetings in the future? So that's something that we're trying to get our arms around to try to make some determinations as to where that's going to go in the future. In relation to your question on the bonds, very early on, we realized we were going to run into an issue with the parking operation. As you know, there were parking lot bonds that were issued on the parking garage construction here at Bradley. We chose to redeem those bonds simply because we knew we were not going to be able to make that business model work for the duration of this pandemic. And there are those in the industry that say normal activities in aviation may not return until 2024. So it was in our best interest to actually redeem those bonds. So we have paid those bonds off. We're now left with the two remaining types of bonds that I talked about, the general airport revenue bonds that back, for example, the construction of improvements here in the terminal building. And we're also left with the CFC bonds that back the ground transportation center that we're constructing right now. We maintain debt service reserves here at the airport. Certainly the bond indentures require us to have a certain amount of coverage. And we feel very confident that if we continue to react smartly to some of the changes that we've made here at the airport, some of the adjustments we've made to the operation, we will be able to get through the pandemic and not have an impact on those bonds. That is how we have dedicated some of the CARES Act money, was to build protections to make sure that we always maintain the level of coverage that we're required to.
Thank you. If there are any other questions, Representative Meskers, are you still?
Yeah, I probably want to follow up offline on the question on the redeemed bonds and on our strategy going forward on our bond service. But I don't want to take up the time in the meeting. Thank you.
Great. And if there are any other questions about service impacts in the wake of COVID, the budgetary impacts, the immediate responses that the airport authority has taken to position itself in the short term, that would be an appropriate time right now to have those questions. Mr. Dillon's going to move in towards sort of what the future looks like at the airport, his thoughts and ideas on legislation and the way to keep the airport authority competitive moving forward. If I want to take an opportunity to just pause for a minute, please raise your hand, come off mute, wave at me, whatever you have to do to get my attention, and we'll ask those questions now so we can get further clarification before we move forward. Representative Carney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Kevin, for all that information. It was a lot of information, but it was important. I mean, I want to Before we move on, I certainly want to commend you and the Airport Authority for all your hard work during this time. I actually was at Bradley, and I can attest you guys are doing a great job. I got tested there. It was extremely easy, extremely quick. So I really want to commend you for all the precautions you've taken during this difficult time. I do have one question, and I don't know if I should be asking this now or asking this later, but we did get word that Embraer is going to be ceasing operations at the airport. I've never heard of the company, so I'm not exactly sure what exactly they do, but I don't know if you could talk about what type of an impact that will have, or if there's any potential, if things get better with the pandemic, they may not leave at the end of March.
Sure. Embraer is actually an aircraft manufacturer. The operation that we have here at Bradley is called a maintenance and repair operation. So it's set up to repair their type of aircraft. Currently, they employ about 35 individuals. We are being advised that they have made a decision to shut down the operation at the end of March. They've already furloughed the administrative staff that are associated with that operation. They are working now to see if they can convince another MRO organization, maintenance and repair organization, to take over their remaining lease term. They're doing that in an effort to try to preserve the technical jobs that are associated with that operation here at Bradley. Whether or not that's likely, we've just begun that conversation with them. They just made that decision in the past week or so to move forward. So I do think there are other organizations out there that certainly would fit within the footprint that we have available here at the airport. And we do have property adjacent to that facility that we could even have an expansion of the facility. Whether or not we can get a company to step in right now with the downturn in aviation across all sectors, that remains to be seen.
All right, well, I appreciate that answer and you know, your focus on trying to get something going there. So thank you.
Sure.
Representative Devlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry for joining this meeting late. I was in the Education Committee. So if you've addressed this, you don't have to recover that ground. I'll watch the recording and get my answers. But if you haven't, could you address the competitive situation currently of Bradley? I know during the summer, you know, we had worked really hard to try to get the governor to agree and others to put testing within the airport facility so we were more competitive with Logan and TF Green. Are there other factors and sort of what are the dynamics around Bradley, you know, being a competitive force for future success as it relates to our other big regional airports? And again, if this has been covered, I'm happy to watch the recording. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. That's a very good question. In fact, I want to highlight, you have a couple of handouts that should have been distributed to you all that, you know, talk about the impacts we're sustaining here at the airport, talk about that competitive issue and a couple of other managerial changes.
Kevin, just for a second. Members, you have internal to the meeting invitation for today, and additionally an email sent out by the committee clerk, 3 handouts that Mr. Dillon is referencing. So if you haven't seen those, they're both in the meeting invitation that was sent out last week and an email today. Those are the handouts that Mr. Dillon is speaking of. They will also be included on our committee's website for the public to review as well. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just want to make sure everyone had the same frame of reference.
But if I could speak to that competitive issue very directly, the airport business has become extremely competitive. Even well before the pandemic, we were competing naturally regionally with airports like Boston and TF Green and New York for passengers. But we're actually competing with every airport in the country for limited airline assets. I mean, the airlines just have so many aircraft that they can spread around the country in terms of their route structure. So it's a constant competition between airports to get those assets. And again, I mean, first and foremost, you have to have a market that can sustain air service. But right behind that, what airlines look at is the business case that an airport can make in terms of making it effective for them to get a yield on putting the assets into your airport, right? So we're constantly looking at our cost structure. Every airport is looking at their cost structure. And, you know, there's a measurement in this business that's called cost per enplanement. Nothing magical about that. It's the total amount of money that airlines pay to an airport divided by the number of departing passengers. And that mathematical result is called the CPE. And that's what airlines look at. So you're constantly focused on what your cost per enplanement is. Here at Bradley, we've had a struggle with that because principally when you start to look at the payroll costs of Bradley versus other airports, we have such a high fringe rate here, it's making us uncompetitive. You know, the salary level across the board of base salaries here in the CAA fall very much within the standards you would find in the aviation world. But when you layer on the fringe rates, which, you know, for non-public safety employees are about 90%, for public safety employees, it's 120% of base salary. You know, the airlines look at that and just can't understand how those costs can be so high. How we've been trying to manage that here at Bradley is we have not been undertaking what I would call appropriate infrastructure improvements. We've been preserving the money that we should be spending on investing into the infrastructure of Bradley to pay our fringe costs. And, you know, again, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but, you know, one of the pieces of legislation that we will be pushing very hard this year is to try to extract our non-union staff from the retirement system, because it really is the retirement system that's putting those fringe costs out of whack. And you've probably heard this before. UConn is running into the same issue in terms of they can't be competitive for grants. Well, we can't be competitive for air service if we continue to pay these high costs. It simply translates into a cost for the airlines, who are essentially paying the lion's share of the bills here at Bradley. So we really do need some assistance in terms of getting that legislation through. I have to stress, this is about non-union employees. If you look at the 30 non-union employees that we have here in the airport authority, and you remove them, you know, quite frankly, there's quite a bit of savings just through the non-union employees. We do feel by giving employees the ability, existing employees, the ability to opt out of the system, that in the first year alone will save $1.25 million. Any, you know, future employee coming into the CAA, non-union future employee, would be required to go into a 401 plan. Ultimately, when they're all transitioned over, we're anticipating a savings of $3 million that can be now turned back into infrastructure improvement here at the airport, or to reduce the rates and charges to the airlines to be competitive. I mean, this has been a significant issue with the airlines all along. The pandemic has only served to heighten that. And in fact, I do believe the committee has been provided letters by two of the organizations that represent the airlines, A4A and NACA, which essentially, if you read those letters very carefully, what those organizations are saying is either get these costs under control, or guess what? Bradley is not going to be getting the service returned following the pandemic. So I can't stress strong enough how important this issue is. And as they started the conversation today, you know, we're not looking for a state handout. We're very proud of the fact that we're not a burden to the state. We're very proud of the fact that we're a self-sustaining enterprise. All we're looking for is the legislature to give us the tools to allow us to manage this very, very important business and economic development agency for the state. And one of those tools is giving us the ability to create this 401 plan and allow our non-union employees to opt out into that plan.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate
if
that
I-
answer. Oh, if I may, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry. And Kevin, if you could just clarify maybe for the public who might be listening to this meeting, you keep referencing a fringe rate. What are you talking about when you mention that?
Right, the fringe rate.
Before we go too far, I know we want to transition into part of that broader introduction of your legislative agenda. There also will be a full public hearing at a later point on each of these proposals. So I don't want to go too far into it. We have some questions from Representative Zalsowski and Senator Austin as well. We're going to finish up with Representative Devlin in just a moment. And just for clarification, we've had this conversation before. What you're referring to as fringe isn't really fringe. It's more of a legacy cost than a fringe cost. It's not as if the benefits associated with these employees are driving up that cost 120%. The same impact on you, don't get me wrong. Same impact on you for these costs, but it's the associated legacy costs of this employee base rather than fringe costs. So I think that's where the lingo inside the building is different than what you may be accustomed to using here. So the distinction that we typically have here. Representative Devlin, can you repeat your question? Then we'll move on to Representative Zalsowski, Senator Austin, and then we'll get back to Kevin's presentation.
Thank you. And that's great to know. We'll be discussing this a lot further going forward. So my question was really clarification. What you were talking about in terms of competitiveness were some significant costs, and you were talking it wasn't salaries, it was fringe. But I don't know that people understand, the general public, in terms of what does fringe mean. So if you could just clarify that, that was all I was seeking. Thank you very much for the indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, the fringe rate covers healthcare costs. It covers the cost of retirement and other employee-related benefits. So when I talk about a fringe rate, you have a base salary that on top of that base salary, this fringe rate gets layered. And just to make the math easy for me, if someone was making $100,000 and they're a non-public safety employee, that's actually costing us $190,000 to keep that employee on payroll. If it's a public safety employee and that public safety employee is making $100,000, it's actually costing us $220,000 to keep that person employed. Because when you look at that fringe rate, each one of those components adds a bit to it: healthcare, retirement. When you talk about the retirement for a non-public safety employee, that represents about 65% of that 90% fringe. A public safety employee, it represents about 90% of that roughly 120% fringe. So you can see that the retirement component is out of step, and the airlines can't understand that. For example, over at TF Green, the retirement cost per employee across the board is 8%. So they look at ours and say, wait a minute, you got a combination of 65% or 90%. Now, as Rep. Lamar pointed out, a good portion of that 60 and 90% is due to the underfunding of the system that's occurred for decades here in Connecticut. But nonetheless, that doesn't make the problem that we're trying to deal with here any less serious. And as I said, I think the legislation that we'll be going through the committee is a very, very appropriate way for us to be able to deal with that here at the airport.
Thank you, Kevin. We're going to go to Representative Zalsowski, then Senator Austin, and then we'll get right back to your presentation. Representative Zalsowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That discussion that we're going to be having on the benefits for the contracts for the non-union employees, I want to emphasize this: non-union employees that we're going to be talking about here is incredibly important. Good to see you, Kevin. Meant to say that. Anyway, Bradley is such an incredibly important economic driver for North Central Connecticut, and it drives a lot of employment as well. So anything that we can possibly do to help that would be just to make it easier. I know that Kevin stated, he's not looking for state money. It's very good to see somebody not with their hand out, but we need to help them and give them the tools. Anyway, something that, not to change the subject, but something that Representative Carney mentioned brought another question to my mind. He was asking about the loss of Embraer coming in March. Wanted to find out whether or not you've gotten any indication from Bombardier, who also does a lot of maintenance at the airport, about staffing levels. I know that this maintenance employs an awful lot of local people, and it would be very helpful to get a little bit more information on Bombardier. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, Rep. I mean, that is one of the entities we want to talk to about potentially even picking up portions of that facility. There are a number of MRO providers out there. We're also hopeful that Bombardier, even if they're not interested in expanding facilities, will look to potentially pick up some of those technical employees that are currently working for Embraer. But right now, it's a relatively new issue. I don't have too much information beyond that to be able to provide.
Thank you. And I want to thank you and the whole gang at Bradley for working so hard to try to keep the traffic up and keep the airport alive for us. So anyway, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Austin, and then we're right back to you, Kevin, to continue with your presentation.
So good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for your presentation, Kevin. But part of it is a little bit skewed, in particular when you start talking about the pension. As you know, we've had specific meetings about the pension and the legacy costs. And quite frankly, Tier 4 employees who are both unionized and non-union employees are already on a hybrid 401k. And that is something that has changed the outlook of our long-term pension obligations. In addition to that, the Tier 3 employees are paying for most of their pension costs. Those costs of a Tier 3 and Tier 4 employee, Tier 4 happen to be some 30% of the workforce now, are generally paying themselves paying the entire cost of their pension system. You know, as well as I do, and I find it to be a little bit sort of distressful that we're not being honest with the people, that the problem with the pension system is Tier 1. Tier 1 ended in 1984. We had 7 decades of not paying our pension system. We have corrected that, and under Governor Malloy, who would not sign a budget that did not include paying the actuarial costs of the pension, and it has been re-amortized twice to bring those costs under impact. And having, when we talk about fringe, that is not where the cost sits. We have dropped down our healthcare costs $100 million just 2 years ago. $100 million. That was healthcare. We dropped out. We are actually paying less for wages in the state of Connecticut than we did 10 years ago. And so when you say fringe, that really is disingenuous to both the people that help fund the airport, your bond folks, and the people that you're having contracts with. Without the true explanation of that, that gives a sense that we are paying these exorbitant benefits to people. Now, Tier 1 employees are not getting a lot of money in their pension, but they did not pay into their pension system, nor did governors, either Democrat or Republican or independent, pay into the pension system as they should have. We are now being responsible with that. Bonding agencies say that Connecticut is responsible with its long-term debt, and I would appreciate it if you would not only recognize that when you're talking, but recognize that our problem is pre-1984. Those employees hired before 1984. So you can say that you want to change to a 401k. Thank you very much for saying that. We've already done that. We have already done that. And so I just hate to have this argument without everybody sort of telling the truth on where we are. Telling the truth on where we are. I appreciate all the work you do, and you know that I personally have set up meetings on the legacy costs with you, with UConn Health, and all of the other agencies that are facing the facts that the prior administrations, Governor Rowland, Governor Rell, Governor Weicker, did not follow the rules and did not pay for the actuarial costs of pensions. So that is the sort of where we are on it. But I want to thank you for the work you do. I think the work you do is fantastic. I'm very proud of Bradley. I'm very proud of our airports around this state, and I'm very proud of the workers that we will continue to support. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
If I could just respond to that quickly, I believe we're being very truthful and very factual here when we talk about this issue. We have asserted all along that this high fringe rate is not resulting in huge pensions for folks. In fact, quite frankly, some of the pension benefit that's available in tiers 3 and 4, I think the employees would actually fare better under the 401 plan that we're proposing here at the airport. No one is disputing that fact, but nonetheless, we still have a problem that's very large and very present right now that has to be solved for us to be competitive here at the airport. I know, you referenced the tier 3 and tier 4 changes, and that's great that the state has moved in that direction. But quite frankly, that's a long-term solution. We need a solution here at Bradley right now to deal with these costs that are so out of step with what's occurring in an industry that we're trying to compete in. So I get it. I said it earlier. This is due to the underfunding for decades of this system, but it doesn't change the problem that we have at the airport right now.
And if I could just reiterate, nor does changing people's benefits and making people take a 401k, which we are already doing. So we are already doing that, both with non-union and union staff. So when we make a differentiation between union and non-union and say we have to change it because we're not doing that, quite frankly, we are doing it. And that was negotiated with Governor Malloy. That tier 4 pension is a hybrid 401k. The facts are that we are doing that already. What you are suggesting we do, we are doing. And that's the frustrating part about it. And I know that I'm meeting with you later on today, and I'm sure we'll have a further discussion on this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And I know, Kevin, we want to walk into the second part of your presentation today, which this is a component of. So I don't want to, we weren't operating backwards here. I know this is a component of your request and how you vision the airport, modifying its operations to meet its future needs. So, and you and I have discussed in the past, this is a more controversial issue that we'll certainly have spent more time on in public hearings over the next month. But I know you've got a lot of ideas, a lot of thoughts, and a lot of planning that you've done in other areas as well. And I want to give you the opportunity to highlight those and talk about the future of Bradley and CAA. Thanks, Kevin.
Sure, thank you. Just to continue on, a number of folks have asked, in the face of the downturn, how are we continuing to make things work here at the airport? Well, there were a number of things that we put in place very early on that have served us well throughout the pandemic. We instituted a hiring freeze last March. That has yielded quite a bit of savings to the airport. We immediately introduced a 10% across the board cut to the fiscal year 20 budget. When we progressed into fiscal year 21, we cut that reduced budgeted number another 8%. So in the aggregate, 18% has been cut across the board out of our budgets. We've deferred about $22 million in capital program or projects here at the airport. And we've deferred salary increases for managerial staff that were due last July. Those increases are deferred indefinitely. And we've introduced initiatives on a targeted basis throughout the organization to enhance efficiency as much as possible in all of our work groups to take full advantage of that hiring freeze. If we can get people to operate and work more efficiently, that means we really need less jobs here. Not that we're looking to lay off people. As I said, that was one of the commitments that we made to our employees, that we were going to avoid involuntary separations here at the airport, but it allows us to keep those jobs vacant a little bit longer. As I said, we talked about, the retirement change. Let me talk about, some of the specific changes that we've introduced that I know a number of committee members have had outreach on. Within our fire department, we've had to introduce a couple of changes to get that efficiency that I talked about. There are two things that we introduced within the fire department here. First, we have reduced the airport's firefighting index. Just to explain what that means, the FAA classifies every airport across the country and puts them into a firefighting index. That's based upon the largest size aircraft that typically operates at the respective airport. Here at Bradley Airport, we had been maintaining firefighting index D as in David. Even though we have not had that size aircraft operate here at Bradley Airport for decades. For whatever reason, once those aircraft stopped operating, the DOT who preceded us remained in index D, and that's just something that we carried forward when we took over the airport as the CAA. We had the resources at that time to do it, so we felt it was in our best interest to continue to do it. We no longer have that luxury. So we have reduced the firefighting index with the approval of the FAA to index C as in Charlie. What that means is we're required to have one less firefighter per shift here at the airport. Now, many times we'll continue to maintain that higher level index because we do have the staffing available to us, but we're no longer bringing somebody in on overtime to maintain an index that's well beyond what the FAA requires us to maintain. And just to put that in numbers, as I said, there has not been any furloughs or layoffs here at the airport. We're not contemplating any. We have, though, reduced the uniform firefighting service here that back in 2015 was at 34 uniform personnel. We are now at 27 personnel. But the thing that I find needs to also be pointed out, not only are we meeting the FAA requirement as it stands for Bradley Airport, we are also one of the few airports in the country that actually has two fire departments here at the airport. We not only have our fire department that meets that FAA index, but the Air Guard that has a base here at Bradley also operates a fire department, which is state funded, and provides another 18 firefighters to Bradley Airport. So when you combine those fire departments, knowing that our one fire department meets the FAA requirements, we're well above where we need to be in terms of firefighting capability at the airport. The other thing that we did is we adjusted the schedule that our firefighters work. Our firefighters pre-pandemic were on a schedule that was fairly inefficient. They worked 24 hours on and had 3 days off. We have switched them to another union-approved schedule, which has them working 24 hours on and then 2 days off, with subsequent days given to them to take off throughout the month when scheduling is more efficient to do so. Right? The sum total of the schedule change that we've introduced has our firefighters working 2 hours more per week, for which they're being compensated naturally for the extra 2 hours that they're working. So I know a number of members of the committee have had outreach from the union alleging that the firefighting capability is not where it needs to be, alleging that the Air Guard Fire Department cannot respond legally to incidents here at the airport. I can tell you those things are factually incorrect. As I just pointed out, we are well beyond where we need to be from an FAA certification standpoint in terms of firefighting capability here at the airport. And certainly the Air Guard has the ability to respond to every incident here at the airport, and they do. The only distinction that I'll make in terms of their response is that under medical responses, they're operating under our authority, under the CAA's authority, right? But just to prove the point, just like our firefighters have been vaccinated, so has the Air Guard. And we wouldn't have been able to do that for them if they weren't able to respond to medicals here at the airport. So I just want to make sure that the record is set straight in terms of what's really involved there. Now, we understand there is a bill before the committee that would start to mandate minimum staffing levels here in the fire department. We are very concerned about that bill. We think it's very inappropriate that legislation would speak to an issue like that. Those are things that if they're to be addressed, they should be addressed during collective bargaining. But quite frankly, if that bill were to pass and we would lose the savings that we've been able to achieve through that hiring freeze that we have in place, we would naturally have no other alternative but to look for savings elsewhere in the organization. And quite frankly, that could lead to layoffs or involuntary furloughs here at the airport, something that we're trying to commit across the board to the entire organization. We're going to look to avoid. So it is a fairly big challenge for us. If I could just transition into the general aviation airports very quickly. As you know, we also operate 5 general aviation airports throughout the state. There are a number of municipally run airports throughout the state. How those airports are funded is through the aviation fuel tax. So aviation fuel that's sold is taxed, and then those tax proceeds under federal law have to go for the benefit of aviation here in the state. Prior to the pandemic, that fuel tax had been generating about $7 to $8 million worth of revenue. And how that money has historically been used, there's 3 funding sources that it goes to. We provide $1.5 million subsidy to Tweed New Haven Airport. We allocate $2 million for capital development at any airport in the state other than Bradley, because Bradley stands on its own. And then the third funding source is the remainder of the money comes to the CAA to run the state general aviation airports, those 5 general aviation airports that we operate. Because of the downturn in aviation activity, those fuel tax collections are off by 75%. So we have had to apply a 75% cut to each one of those funding. As you can imagine, when you take Tweed, for example, and you apply a 75% cut to that $1.5 million, understand that the $1.5 million makes up almost 50% of their operating budget. It's a significant issue, right? Cutting the capital program by 75% will defer a lot of projects. And then naturally the CAA airports, we have to figure out, utilizing our reserves, how we're going to continue to operate those 5 airports. In the case of Tweed, we are working with OPM right now to try to find another funding source to make up the difference in terms of the 25% we've been able to give them so that they can get the full $1.5 million. We're not exactly sure where OPM is going to find that money, but we continue to have a dialogue with them about it. But a long way of saying that I do believe it's probably time for us to have a significant policy discussion about where we're going with airports here in the state. You know, there's been a downturn in traffic to begin with prior to the pandemic. And quite frankly, there are going to be fundamental changes within the aviation industry going forward. We should probably talk about the necessity of continuing to operate all of the airports that are currently being operated today. In the case of Tweed, we probably should be talking about is it appropriate to continue to focus on commercial service development down in Tweed? And if so, what is the implication to Bradley Airport that's going to have to struggle quite a bit with the national competition in terms of developing commercial service. Where does Sikorsky fit in terms of the commercial service development? There have been proposals in the past, for example, for all commercial service airports here in the state to be operated by the CAA for the very reason that you don't want to be taking actions at one airport that starts to hurt the other airport. If they're operated by one entity, policies can be introduced to make sure that appropriate development is occurring at all of these airports. Very similar to what you would find in New York with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey that operates LaGuardia, Kennedy, and Newark airports. You can imagine what would happen if those airports were allowed to compete with each other unconstrained. So we're proposing, that the same type of thing be looked at here in Connecticut. And I think, at some point, this is a conversation that will most likely come back to the Transportation Committee. We're engaging OPM in the governor's office right now to start that conversation. But I think knowing that most industry experts are saying that it's going to be till 2024 before this industry starts to recover to pre-pandemic levels, this is going to be a multi-year issue that really should be addressed going forward. I'll finish up with just a couple of other quick updates, hopefully try to give you some good news. We were recently informed by USA Today that we've been nominated as one of the best small airports in the country. We're competing right now with 15 airports. That's in their 10 best readers poll. I encourage everyone to go online. You can go to votebdl.com and vote for Bradley Airport. You can actually vote every day, so you can vote multiple times and you can vote on multiple devices. It's a great way, if Bradley does come in at number one, to highlight Bradley and Connecticut on a national level. Despite cutbacks by many airlines, I'm also pleased to say that we did get a couple of announcements from airlines. JetBlue in particular announced the start of Cancun service, Los Angeles service, San Francisco, and Las Vegas. Very key cities for us. I mean, there were very specific reasons why they announced that service, but we're thankful nonetheless that we did get that flight activity into the airport. Also pleased to say that Southwest has recently announced that they'll be starting Nashville service in the spring. Unfortunately, they're most likely going to be making some other adjustments in their schedules to free up aircraft here at Bradley, but it's nice to include a city like Nashville in our route structure. So I'll end there, but let me finish by saying that aviation, and in particular Bradley, is going to play a critical role in the state's economic recovery and the future business and economic development here in the state. And the actions that we've taken, the actions that we're proposing to take, are all geared towards letting Bradley serve as a critical economic development tool. So I hope we can continue to count on the committee's support. The committee's been very supportive of Bradley Airport in the future, and we thank you for everything you do for us.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the time and energy that you've put into coming to the committee today to keep us up to date on the many actions that you've taken over the last year. Alex Peterson, who we're not seeing here today, many of our committee members know him quite well because he has continually been available to all of us. He continues to send out updated information about the challenges and the successes that Bradley has had over the last year. And so we are deeply appreciative of your hiring of him and his commitment to us on keeping us up to date. And we are very thankful to have you in the leadership role over this past year. You've provided a degree of stability that a lot of airports across the country envy. And so we do appreciate that. The aspects of the future that we may see some disagreements on this committee, we'll have an opportunity to talk about them more. That public hearing will likely be scheduled sometime in February, and there'll be an opportunity for all interested parties to come before us and share their vision and thoughts about how the airport authority moves forward in those specific regards. But I think there is, and you alluded to this, broad-based consensus that the future of Connecticut relies on having a strong and competitive Connecticut Airport Authority and an attractive Bradley Airport. So I want to make sure as we go through our process of fighting over the details of specific policy proposals or legislation, we are on your side and you are fighting for us. So as we move forward, I think that's important to keep in context, and we'll work out the details as we proceed, but we are fighting for you. We want to make sure that we get as much as we can done to competitively position us moving forward.
Hey, thanks for my district.
And so I know that there are questions. If folks who can find the raise hand button can raise their hands, I'd appreciate that. If you cannot find that button, just wave, put on your video and wave to me, and I will call on you immediately. And so we'll start here. Actually, I'm seeing no questions at this point. So anyone wants to jump in first? Amazingly, Kevin, I believe that you have accomplished the goals of this meeting, and there are no questions at this point. I think everyone's just waiting for that public hearing to go delve into it further.
Either that or I've worn everybody down.
That's an effective strategy too. All right. With that, thank you, Kevin, for your time and effort and for making yourself and Alex available to us at all times. If there are committee questions, please forward them to either the committee leadership or committee clerk or directly to Alex, and the information will come forward to us quickly and completely. And we really do appreciate your attendance here today. Connecticut Airport Authority is positioned to do well. We need to make sure that we're doing our part on the legislative side and on the state side to maintain that competitiveness. So with that, thank you, Kevin, for your time.
Thank you.
For committee members, like I said at the beginning, this is a very busy week. This concludes the second of our 4 oversight hearings, and we will have an opportunity to work with the DOT at their presentation on Wednesday and the Connecticut Port Authority on Friday. We also have a public hearing coming up on Wednesday at noon where we'll see the Department of Motor Vehicles full legislative request for the coming year, as well as a comprehensive pedestrian safety bill that we've been working on for a few years previously with Representative Devlin, Senator Martin, and Senator Leone. We're now got it before us again, trying to put on the finishing details of that with our current leadership team. We'll have that public hearing on Wednesday as well. If there are any questions for our DOT folks that you want to make sure that they're prepared to answer, if you want to give us that information, we'll make sure they're prepared on that level. And if there are anything that you want to have the committee introduce or consider as part of another oversight or informational hearing, please let us know. We've got the time in February to have these informational meetings so we can give our membership more information. Senator Cassano and Representative Carney, we'll move to you for closing remarks. Senator Cassano?
Yes, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry I missed the beginning of the meeting. I was in another meeting and missed another meeting. That's a crazy week. It was great to hear the end of it. I'm very impressed with the direction that the airport's going. Some interesting concepts have been raised about some combinations of service and so on, and I think that's critical for us to look at, and so looking forward to it. Thanks very much.
Senator Summers?
Yes, good morning. Thank you. I just wanted to thank everybody for the presentation. It was very informative. As somebody who's new to transportation, I was really interested in some of your new ideas moving forward, and I want to thank you for your presentation. And I'm sure there'll be more questions as we have time to digest, but I think you did a great presentation, and I'm looking forward to working on this going forward.
And Representative Carney.
No, just to echo everybody's comments, it's obviously the airport authority is very important to the state, and Bradley is extremely important to the state. And, it's really vital to the future of our economic well-being that that airport is as healthy as possible, and that we can, do everything we can to ensure that it survives at its best possible rate throughout the rest of this pandemic.
Hey,
Thank you very much.
Mr.
Sorry.
Chairman.
Yes, Senator Kissel.
I just wanted to say, since Bradley's in my district, it really means
Senator Kissel, you muted yourself halfway through there.
yeah, I know. I don't know why that happened. I just wanted to say it was a great presentation. I appreciate all the efforts of the chairs and leaders. And I never knew that Senator Casano played for the Whalers.
Yeah, he lined up next to Bobby Orr, it looks like, back there.
Yeah, I don't know. What the heck? He's like a hockey player. In any event, no, we've got great people ahead of this committee. And I appreciate all your efforts.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Clerk, I believe I indicated the full schedule ahead of us. Just for reference, can you remind everyone again, and then we will call it a day.
Yes, Mr. Chair. On Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock, we will be having the third of our informational forums with the Department of Transportation. At 12 o'clock that day, we will be having our first public hearing. As you said, the bills will be the Department of Motor Vehicles recommendations, which I believe is Senate Bill 216, and a bill concerning pedestrian safety, among other items. I believe that's House Bill 5429. I might be mistaken on that. That again will be at 12 o'clock on Wednesday. And on Friday, I believe at 9 o'clock in the morning is the time slot scheduled for our final information forum with the Connecticut Port Authority.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Clerk. And with that, we are adjourned for the day.
Thank you very much. Look forward to seeing everybody later this week. Bye.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Mr. Chair.